Hello, welcome to History 102. We're going to go over Lecture 12, the 1950s. The 1950s in current American culture is an interesting decade. Kind of focus on it in our day and age for cultural and political reasons. The 1950s has three areas that three parts of our culture kind of look at the 1950s in a certain way. Number one, nostalgia. The baby boom generation, born between 1946 and 1965, grew up during the 1950s. The 50s were their childhood. And so it's considered to be the largest generation in American history. And in our era, the 2020s, they're getting into their 70s. The oldest are getting into their 80s, and most are in their 70s. And as any culture does, as any generation gets older, they start looking at their childhood as better than their current circumstances. And so the 1950s, in a lot of ways, is romanticized, idealized as a better era, especially than today. Another interesting thing about the 1950s and even into the 60s is, we're 7 decades removed from the 1950s, yet, you can still hear music from the era. People still watch TV shows from the era, as they get older. Shows like I Love Lucy and early rock and roll like Elvis Presley. The second area is traditionalism. More traditional or quote-unquote conservative Americans, and we'll have to define that term now, more traditional Americans, see the 1950s as the last moral decade. The last decade when America was united by culture, by language, by history, by morality, and by patriotism. And so more traditional minded individuals kind of look at the 1950s as kind of that last good decade before the chaos of the 1960s and 70s. And so in this view, you focus on the positives of the 1950s. Billy Graham, one of the most famous television preachers of the era, regularly appeared on prime time. New York City skyscrapers would put up, light their buildings with crosses during Easter and Christmas. In the 1950s, no one was getting upset with Christmas trees or Christmas displays on government property. Patriotism, from our modern day point of view, America was viewed as good. Polls in the 1950s showed Americans had a much higher level of trust in the government than they do today, much higher faith in politicians than they do today. And so for more traditional-minded Americans, the 1950s is kind of that safer, more ordered, more moral, more patriotic America. And so it kind of gets viewed in that way from this point of view. More progressive Americans see the 1950s as kind of the opposite, the last evil decade, the last unevolved decade before the alleged progress of the 60s and 70s. And so you can see how the 1950s kind of gets into that culture war. And we've talked about that in class a few times, the culture wars, the 1920s with religion and science, and then as we go further down the class into the 70s, 80s, and 90s and onward, we'll talk more about those quote-unquote culture wars that seem to divide Americans and American society. So another reason why the 1950s are viewed as such a wonderful decade is it comes after what? The Great Depression in the 30s and World War II in the 40s. And then in the 60s, you have the chaos of the Vietnam War, race rioting, Watergate in the 70s, the anti-war movement. And so the 1950s is kind of tucked in between these two eras of chaos, turmoil, society changing rapidly, right? So the 50s kind of looks like a calm in between the storm, the eye of the storm, so to speak. The Depression in the 30s, World War II in the 40s, then the 60s, the Vietnam War, anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the more extreme elements of the civil rights movement with race rioting, and then you get into the 70s. Assassinations in the 60s too. And then in the 70s you get, Watergate, stagflation, a bad economy. So the 50s kind of, compared to the previous couple decades and couple decades after, the 50s looks, really good. And so looking at the economy, the Depression's over. The Depression era's ended. Gross domestic product 20% higher in 1960. 250% higher than the previous decade. Okay. In the 1950s, science and medicine seemed to be taking leaps and bounds. The beginning of DNA, of DNA research, where we find out that, hey, what makes up our insides, our genetics. You have the development of the idea of what an atom looks like, and then you have Jonas Salk with the polio vaccine. Before the 1950s, polio, if it either crippled you or killed you. Today, 2022, very few people get polio. It's largely disappeared as a disease. And then with the vaccine, all these vaccines, a lot of childhood diseases disappear. Previous to the 1950s, people regularly got measles, mumps, German measles, chickenpox, all kinds of childhood illnesses that once vaccinated for, today people very rarely get. We talked about this during the Cold War. The Cold War competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union will fuel space race. What upsetting to most 1950s Americans is the fact that, in a way, the Soviets won the space race by launching the first satellite into space, Sputnik, in 1957. You can go read the newspapers of the era when Sputnik was launched, and the Soviets got into orbit first. There was some hysteria in the American media and culture during that era. America was falling behind. We needed to catch up. And when you get to the election in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, that falling behind the Soviets is going to be a big part of the campaign. The Kennedy campaign arguing that the Eisenhower administration, with Nixon in it as vice president, was falling behind the Soviets in the space race. They had gotten there first, and then with nuclear weapons, the supposed missile gap. It turns out it wasn't correct or true, but there's a perceived, that we were falling behind the Soviets. In 1960, Yuri Gagarin, first man in orbit. So the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space. They get the first man into orbit, so we're falling behind. Our first astronauts in space are going to be John Glenn, and then we'll finally get artificial satellites into orbit. We did win the animal battle. The Soviets sent a dog into space. We sent a monkey. Our monkey lived, and the dog died. So, in that sense, I guess at least an American animal beat an American monkey, an animal, beat a Soviet dog. So we won that one. We talked about nuclear weapons during the Cold War. So here's some information about it. You have an arms race. Both the U.S. and the Soviets started developing massive nuclear weapons, stockpiling them, making them bigger and more destructive, hundreds of times more destructive than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then you start putting them on ice submarines, start putting them on ships. You start fueling your ships with nuclear power. Then you start building intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that can you can hit a target a continent away. I kind of already mentioned this, the baby boom. Americans went home from World War II and had a lot of children. 1946, actually 1946 and 1965 is the generally kind of accepted era of the baby boom. 1946 and 1960 is a much more um, strict kind of baby boom definition, but some sociologists go all the way to 1965. It's a population explosion after World War II. It's going to be the largest generation in 20th history, and it's still the biggest in American history, although the current generation being born is going to be bigger than that one. There's a new trend in American population during American society during the 1950s, the idea of the suburb. Okay. The suburbs developed in the 1950s. Previous to the 1950s, most Americans lived, if they did live in a city, they lived in the city proper. Okay. They lived, close to downtown, the surrounding area, worked in the city, played in the city, um, you know, went to the downtown area a lot. Downtown areas were generally very nice, very decorative. Sporting events held there, concerts held there, things to do in that area of town. In the 1950s, with a population boom and Americans coming home from World War II, you're going to see something called the rise of a suburb. What is a suburb? It is a satellite city. So you have the main city, like for example Las Vegas or Phoenix, and then, but people they want to move to the city, but they start living further and further away, where they're not the same city anymore. They're satellite cities. So for example, Las Vegas, we have Henderson. Phoenix had Glendale, where I grew up. You have a new vocabulary of words develop, the commute. Okay, and so during the 50s and onward, Americans started living farther and farther away from their workplace. So you get to where all of a sudden you would live in one city, but you work in another. This would develop this idea called bedroom community, like a suburb, a bedroom community where it's an area where people just live. It's a residential area. Bedroom, it's where they sleep. They just go to live, but they do everything else elsewhere in the city or in other regions. Okay. Tract housing and a subdivision. Mass-produced housing develops in the 1950s, and you can see that all over the place. Go to Las Vegas, here in Las Vegas. Go to an older neighborhood built before the 1950s or around the 50s. The houses are all going to look a little different, right? More original. Go look at houses built after the 60s. There will be what's called models, right? A builder will build a subdivision with maybe 2 or 3 models that you pick from. So all of a sudden houses kind of start looking the same. For example, when I grew up, the house I grew up when I was like 4 and 5 and 6, it had a certain floor plan. It was in a subdivision. Well, some years later on, when I was a late teenager, like 17, 18, our family moved into another house in that same subdivision area. Guess what? It was the same floor plan as the house I lived in when I was 4, 5, and 6 or so. Okay, that's an example of this mass-produced housing, where instead of building custom houses, every house is unique and custom, you start building floor plans, and multiple people can have the same floor plan. And like for example, I lived in 2 different houses when I was like 4 to 7, and then later on when I was like 16 to 18, 2 different houses, but they had the same floor plan. It was a little weird. Okay. Next. Another new word is going to come into the American vocabulary during this era, the computer. Okay. When you get into the study of computer technology, World War II is kind of going to be the beginning of the development of technology. There is some development of the technology that will become computers in the 30s. The 40s, we'll see the first idea of a computer, something that processes information faster than a human being can. In the 1950s, you had the first commercial computer called the UNIVAC computer. This baby is massive, rooms big. Okay, tapes are used for storage. It was slow and couldn't do much. For example, a UNIVAC computer in the 1950s, the number of operations it took a day to do. Today, your iPhone does in a couple of seconds. So that's how slow and kind of like bad these computers are. Your modern day iPhone or smartphone that you have, it can do the same amount of operations in a few seconds that it would take a UNIVAC computer a day to do. And so there's some evolution. In the 1950s, you have the first computer company, IBM. And then in 1952 is kind of when a lot of Americans learned the word computer for the first time. CBS, during the 1952 election campaign, on election night, they used a UNIVAC computer to predict the presidential race and the votes coming in, and to kind of tabulate who might win. The UNIVAC computer actually did get it right. Eisenhower eventually won, so that's interesting. Going along with computers, you have technology like transistors. What's cool about a transistor is it amplifies electronic signals, so you have what's called the process of miniaturization. Go look at TVs and radios. Before the 1950s. They're big. Even TVs in the 50s and 60s are massive, right? Today, you can watch TV on your iPhone, right? Video on your iPhone. Okay. Hearing aids. Look at hearing aids in the past. They're kind of big and clunky. I wear a hearing aid in class, and you probably don't even realize it. It's stuck in my ear. Okay. Integrated circuits allow computers to, one, do more things at once, go faster, and talk to other computers. If you want to talk about the beginnings of the internet, you can see the beginnings in the 1950s with the development of integrated circuits. And that's what the internet is. It's computers or servers, servers talking to each other. Well, you need integrated circuits to do that. Television's the new big thing. So remember when we talked about the 1920s? We have radio kind of being the big thing for entertainment. Well, here in the 1950s, televisions developed. There are television models from early as the late 1930s. You can go Google search those. Kind of interesting. Very, very early TVs, like during World War II, very few people had them. They're very expensive. And they're generally only available in large cities like New York because only a few big, massive cities like New York and Boston had a TV station that broadcast those signals. And so what you would do is during World War II and a little after World War II, what you would do is you turn the TV set on and you would leave it on. It only had one channel. You turn it on and leave it on, and it would pick up whatever broadcast signal was sent out. And so very early TV, not very, I guess, interesting or entertaining. You just turn the set on and let it pick up whatever it could. Okay. Of course, TVs are going to get a little bit better. You'll have channels. You'll have networks. 1946, there's about 17,000 TVs in the United States. Again, mostly in very large cities, New York, Boston. Just a decade later, there's going to be 40 million TVs. So you can see how TV explodes as an entertainment choice for Americans. It's going to replace radio as the number one form of radio. NBC and CBS were the first radio companies. They'll become the first television companies in the late 40s. NBC, CBS is still around, right? ABC will come later. Fox won't come until the 80s, but ABC will be a later one too. Okay. Television shows in the late 1950s focused on white middle-class suburban culture. When you go look at TV shows in the 1950s, I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, They kind of focus on what you and I would consider a kind of a narrow part of American society. Presidential politics. We have one president during the 1950s. Most of the 1950s. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican, 1953 to 61. He signed the piece of legislation for the National Highway Act. And you guys have the interstate system today. 41,000 miles of highway. The reason it was built, the reason Congress approved it was in the name of national defense. So it was supposed to be a defense measure. If, in case of an invasion by another country, troops and supplies could be quickly moved across the country. Okay, and of course we have that today. I'm assuming, well, I guess shouldn't assume, the interstate system does have an order. It goes from north to south. So east-west highways go, the lower numbers are south, the higher numbers are north. So I-10 south, Houston, Phoenix, right? Then you have I-20, I-30, I-40 is what? I-40 goes through Kingman, right? And then it goes on and up. And then from east to west, starting on the west coast, you have low numbers. Like here in Vegas, we have I-15, right? Or I-11 and I-15. I grew up in Phoenix. The main interstate was 17. And you go further east. I lived in Houston for a while. The main interstate was, I want to say 45. I could be wrong. It could be 35, but I think it's 45. And then if you go all the way east to like New York, they have like 95. Okay, so north and south interstates, west are low numbers, east are high numbers, and east to west highways, low numbers in the south, up to high numbers in the north. All right. Interestingly enough, the economy will grow during Eisenhower's administration, just a little bit slower than during Truman's. For GI, this is the beginning of the GI Bill. A lot of military people go to school with the GI Bill. National Defense Act, 1958. First federal aid to education, justified in the name of defense of the country. We're going to talk about the civil rights movement in the 60s. That's kind of the popular decade, the 1960s, to talk about the civil rights movement. We tend not to look at the 1950s as the beginning of that. And so I want to go over some of the civil rights movement in the 40s and 50s. We've already talked about, in 1947, you have Frank Robinson breaking the color barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Then you have the civil rights movement in the 1940s. Truman rescinds Democrat Woodrow Wilson's policy of segregating the federal government. The military will begin to industrialize. In 1954 is the famous Brown versus Board of Education decision, which argued that segregation by default was unconstitutional. Remember we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson that said, well, you're separate but equal. That can be constitutional just as long as you're, giving equal, money towards each, right? 1954, the Supreme Court argued that any separation is unconstitutional and unequal. So it's kind of you're looking at it and you're assuming that any type of segregation or separation is immediately inequality, and so you rule that schools cannot segregate. Okay. State schools must desegregate with all due speed. It doesn't set the timetable. Most school districts, especially in the South, will ignore Brown versus Board of Education. So you're not actually going to see integration in a lot of places until even as late as the 1970s, which brought about forced busing. And when we get to the 70s, we'll talk about forced busing. That is a controversial issue. Forced busing. It even happened in the 80s when I was a kid. Definitely a controversial issue. We'll talk about it when we get to the 70s. But by the 1970s, the federal government, progressives in the federal government, deemed that Americans weren't, integrating fast enough or enough. So they implemented some radical ideas like forcing people to go to school, 40 miles from where they lived. What's sad in a way, it disproportionately affected black students. it would take black students from one school and force them to go to a white school like 20, 30 miles away. So in some ways, it kind of ended up hurting black students because it forced them to go to a school 30, 40 miles away. It didn't usually work the other way, where you have white kids go to a black school. It kind of went the other way, and so there's some issues there. There is a Las Vegas example. My mom and brothers moved to Las Vegas in 1991, and my brother had to go to a sixth grade school, not the one he was closest to, but for equity, for racial equity. He had to go to a school in another, like further away, and so it still kind of existed even in the 90s. Okay. 1956 is the famous Rosa Parks bus incident. The Birmingham bus boycott. What's kind of left out of that popular story is it's kind of portrayed as kind of spontaneous, that one day Rosa Parks just decided to sit somewhere. Rosa Parks is a member of the NAACP. She is planning. She and the local Birmingham NAACP are planning on challenging the Birmingham bus system's rule that a black passenger had to give up their seat to a white passenger if the white person asked. And so the popular history is a little bit wrong. It says, black people had to sit in the back of the bus, and that's not true. A black or African American rider could sit wherever they wanted. Okay, it's just if you're sitting somewhere and a white person wanted to sit there, either crowding or whatever, they would ask you to move, and you'd have to move. And so a lot of African American bus riders just sat in the back because they didn't want to have to. They didn't want to have the hassle of. They didn't want to have to go through the hassle of getting them and moving just because some white person asked them to move. And so that's kind of how it ends up. It's kind of a cultural, you can sit wherever you want, but you want to go through the hassle of moving every time you're asked. Well, no. So a lot of black bus riders just decided to just sit in the back on their own. So what Rosa Parks and the NAACP are challenging is just that rule that, why can't an African American individual just sit wherever they want, and why do they have to move just because a white person asks them to? And it goes back to just that idea of respect. We had to kind of go. The last time I did the history club in 2014-15, we had somebody come and talk to our history club about segregation. And that was one of the things he brought up. He grew up during segregation, and that's one of the things he brought up. Was that kind of the problem with segregation from his point of view? It was just as a black person, you had to respect the white person no matter what. It was like you had to do whatever they said, kind of a thing. You had to be extra respectful or extra careful. And so that kind of where that Birmingham bus rule kind of comes in is, you can sit wherever you want. It's just if a white person comes along and wants you to move, you have to move. So it's just that. So for this gentleman who kind of talked to us about him growing up during segregation, that was kind of the idea. It was just this idea that the order was such that you had to be respectful no matter what. You had to do, and the only reason being, well, they're of European descent and you're of African descent, and so that was an interesting thing to listen to this gentleman talk about that. But anyways. So what Rosa Parks is challenging is that this idea that I have to move, just because somebody of European descent wants to sit here, but and it doesn't work vice versa. If an African American individual wants to move and asks a white person to move, the white person doesn't have to do it, and so it's kind of the double standard there. So that's the famous incident where Rosa Parks rides the bus, and so she's actually riding it several times. For the boycott to work, she has to be challenged. You know what I mean? let's say she rides the bus for a month and no one asks her, you know. So, she makes sure it's a situation where she'll be asked to move, and if she refuses, she'll get arrested. She'll get arrested, and that begins the Birmingham bus boycott. The Birmingham city will capitulate because it'll hurt the profits of the bus. It just so happens most of the riders of the Birmingham bus system are African American, and so when you don't have black people or black individuals riding the bus, you don't make any money. So, in the 1957, there is a popular. You've heard popular stories of white women giving their maids rides during this boycott just to get them to work, and there are some instances of that. Okay, well, there's actually a movie about it. I can't remember the name of the movie, but of some white women, if they have maids or servants, I'll come pick you up and bring you. So it's kind of like we'll let this the boycott. You're boycotting the bus. So 1957, you have the Little Rock Central High School. Kind of remember what I've already mentioned. The Supreme Court says you can't segregate based on race. Well, very few school districts are doing it. Okay. The Republican Eisenhower administration decides to push the issue in Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They send in federal troops to federally desegregate the school and escort black students to school, around campus, and home. And there's the famous story of one of the students, actually all of them, they would be in class by themselves because white parents wouldn't let their kids go to school with them. So that is a true story. That is accurate. So you have that. You do have a Civil Rights Act during this era, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, strongly opposed by Democrats, only passed because of Republican support. It's a weaker version of the more famous 1964 Civil Rights Act. Some critics of the 1950s. We have the birth of rock and roll. Rock and roll is a blend of several different types of music: jazz, blues, big band, and even country music. And you can see that. You can see that when you study different early rock and roll stars. They come from different genres: Chubby Checker, jazz and blues; Ritchie Valens, Latin; Elvis, country; Buddy Holly, big band. You can kind of see this development of rock and roll comes from all kinds of genres of music. The two basic instruments of a rock and roll band are, of course, the guitar and drums. So those are the two basic instruments, and then you add on from there. Beatniks. You can kind of call them hippies of the 50s. They're kind of not about. Beatniks were anti-establishment poets and writers of the 50s that critiqued 1950s society in a lot of ways. And some of the ways that the 1950s gets critiqued today. William White Jr. wrote a book called Organization Man. It's a very interesting book if you want to read it. It's kind of a... some students are surprised at how early this idea was of the soulless corporation or the soulless corporate man going to work every day, the empty suit, going to work every day and coming home. William White Jr. wrote a book called Organization Man, and it did critique that corporate culture, that corporate military-industrial complex, and it's taking away man's soul and identity. You're just a number. You're just a suit. You don't exist. You're to corporate. You're just a employee ID. And so that's kind of an interesting look at the 1950s. And in fact, President Eisenhower, when he left office, he gave a speech where he warned Americans of this military-industrial complex and how it can take over the economy, drive wars, drive the economy, destabilize your society as well as other countries' societies too. And then there's of course rural, urban poverty and segregation. And that when we look at nostalgic, when we look at nostalgic views of the 1950s, we don't usually see that. Kind of like with the 1920s. Remember in the 1920s, we talked about the Jazz Age. Um, we don't see the bad times in the 1920s, right? Where like the 1920s were great and wonderful. Well, that's for people living in cities, right? We go to the 1920s and talk to rural Kansas folk. They'll look at the roaring 20s as evil, immoral, right? And so just same thing here in the 50s, more nostalgic views of the 50s, the TV shows of the 50s, right? Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, traditional family structure, traditional gender roles. It kind of, in some ways, kind of leaves out that there are other Americans experiencing different things, rural and urban poverty, and then in segregation. You don't really have 1950s TV dealing with segregation, right? It doesn't exist in TV. And that's the thing. TV in the 1950s was meant more for entertainment. We'll get to the 70s. We'll compare and contrast that. By the 70s, more and more people looked at TV as a way to get your political message across. And of course, today we're saturated with where everyone thinks the purpose of TV is to push your political agenda. It's why TV shows and movies are kind of horrible now, because they're political messages rather than entertainment. That is 1950s. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.